Right. Well, thank you very much, Anthony, for all of your work organizing this event and for the opportunity to discuss Manon's book with her. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity, not least because I read the French book on which it is based, On ne n'est pas soumise, on le dit bien, in 2018, and I found a great deal to appreciate about it. And so I wanted to say a little bit about what I appreciated about it, to provide some context to my first question for Manon. So for heuristic reasons, I'm going to call some of these reasons philosophical and others feminist. And I'm expecting some of the feminist ones especially to come out as the discussion goes on. But philosophically, I read your book with interest because in France, there are few other books that engage with Beauvoir qua philosopher, and especially not in the way in which your book does. So there are a few scholars like Michel Caille, who has written on Beauvoir as a philosopher, and some literary studies by people like Jean-François Douet. But in France, Beauvoir doesn't have the same philosophical profile that she has in places like United States. Even in the works of Michel de Beauvoir, we have this line that she rejected philosophy. And you present her as a philosopher who engages critically in an original philosophical manner with Hegel and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, among many others. And as someone whose work can speak to the concerns of contemporary feminists and contemporary women. And I admired in your book the attention that you gave to ordinary life. And one of the things that I was struck by was the fact that the original English translation, Howard Parsley's translation, cut Beauvoir's analysis of housework. And so much of the reception of Beauvoir in the English-speaking world didn't even have some of the aspects that I think are really important in the second sex. Your book is not just about Beauvoir. It's about the concept of submission. And the idea that submission repays closer analysis from the perspective of women who are expected to submit. And I was really struck by the French cultural tropes in your book when I read it in French. And because I know that the English version, here it is, is an expanded version. It's not just a translation. It's a book that you've taken time to write specifically for an English audience. I wondered if you could say first why you wrote the book the first time in French and what it is that you hope for out of this English version. So what it is you think that the English version can bring to discussions of feminism? That's a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Anthony, for the invitation, and thank you for everyone who joined us today. So it's true that in a way, it's the same book and two different books. So initially what happened is that I wrote these very French dissertation on women's submission. Well, actually, not even on women's submission. My dissertation was on consenting to one's submission in general. And it's this super French dissertation in the sense that it's, I think, 260,000 words. So it's enormous. And I defended it, I think 3 months before the Weinstein affair started and the hashtag #MeToo like caught up in the middle of the Weinstein affair. And so suddenly there was an interest in France for feminism that seemed very different from what was happening until then. And I got a call from a journalist from Libération saying, I heard you work on consent. We have no one who works on consent. Can you do an interview with us? And my plan at that point was to publish my dissertation as an academic book in a serious academic press in English and to rewrite it for in English for an American audience, since I was living in the US at that point and still do. And I thought, okay, maybe now is the time to work for Beauvoir's reception, because I felt like I had this chapter in my dissertation about Beauvoir and women's submission, And I thought, one will want to read a book called The Philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, but if I manage to show through a very current problem that it's interesting to read Beauvoir, maybe I'll demonstrate that she's worth reading as a philosopher. So it was really a sort of very contingent set of reasons that made me write the book. And I wrote it, as I think is mostly possible in France, as a real philosophy book, but accessible for everyone. And I think in that regard, I was also guided by Beauvoir, because I think that's what she's been doing. And so I wrote this book, and my publisher, that because she also published your biography, helped me make it accessible, and I think it's been considered accessible for a French audience. And then when Princeton bought the rights, it was supposed to be translated by someone else, and I thought I thought it would not translate well, because there is a very French way of writing philosophy that I think, that it doesn't work. Even the sort of cultural expectations that you can have, that people have gone to high school in France and have studied philosophy, and so they have a vague sense of a lot of things. You can refer to the Odyssey and say, oh yeah, Penelope waiting, everyone knows what you're talking about. So you need to change a few things when you translate from French to English. And also, I felt like the purpose of the book changed, because I didn't have this sort of line of argument of saying, look, Beauvoir is a philosopher. I took it for granted that in the English-speaking world, it was much more recognized, thanks to the work of many people, including one of my dear mentors, Nancy Bauer. And so I think there was no need for this argument, but there was also a need to convince the readers, maybe, that submission was a good philosophical concept and that there was work to be done with it. So I had to change a little bit the book. And I also wanted to include some work I had done since to deepen some parts, like, for instance, my work on love that I had published in French, and I then wanted to include in the book in English. So yeah, that's what happened.
Okay, brilliant. So this takes us nicely to the concept of submission itself. So why do you think the concept of submission deserves philosophical analysis? Let's start.
So I'd say it's linked also to this question of the attention to ordinary life. I felt very early on that there was a problem with oppression, with domination, with exploitation, which is that these concepts look at the power dynamic either from a neutral standpoint or from the standpoint of the people who have the power. And I think that it leads to a problem, especially in the case of women, which is that their situation is associated to passivity. And that people think, oh, male domination means that women are passive. But the reality is that even very traditional women who live by the norms of patriarchy and even like the norms of patriarchy, like the trad wives, like this movement in social media, they do a lot of things. And I think the concept of submission helps us see that there is an activity there. It is not just waiting and doing nothing. Precisely what parts of what submission is to diet, is to work out, is to be sexy, is to be extremely caring, is to be. So there are a lot of things that women do in the context of patriarchy because of the gender norms of patriarchy and because of what is expected of them. But I think it's a form of injustice that is done to them if we only look at it as passivity. And that actually what is interesting also from a feminist point of view is to look at what women's lives are, like what exactly is going on. And I feel like these concepts that adopt a sort of top-down view on women's lives are very helpful in many ways. I mean, I'm my feminist mothers and inspirators, and like I'm extremely grateful, but I think there's a value in looking at these power dynamics from another perspective, that is from a bottom-up perspective.
So could you give us, so we've heard a few examples of submission. So being caring, for example, is something that you just said could be a matter of being submissive, or of dieting or working out or these sorts of things. So why do you think women do these things? If, as I understand your argument, you're saying that submission involves a kind of relinquishing of their own freedom. So what does this do for women?
So I think actually, the more I think about it now, I mean, it's been 10 years of thinking about it, but I actually think that there are two things. There's the fact that women are expected to be submissive, and so to behave in submissive ways in respecting the authority of men, for instance. And you see it at work, for instance. There's a person I really love, but I don't know if she would want to be quoted, so I'm gonna quote her anonymously, who has a high position at work and who says that there's another man who has the exact same position, but if she were to speak the way he speaks, if she were to propose the way he proposes things at work, she would be seen as too authoritative, too dictatorial, and so she has to, every time she wants to propose a new thing for her workplace, she needs to propose it in a way that is not going to be perceived as not feminine. So there's this sort of submissive attitude that is expected of women. And then there's the fact that you're supposed to submit to gender norms in adopting submissiveness. So there's a sort of two layers of submission. And I think, I don't mean to say that it's wrong to work out, it's wrong to be caring, it's wrong to be nice, quite the contrary, actually. But what I find interesting is that this sort of behavior is used to or has been used to identify a weakness or an inferiority of women. So it's because it's negatively conceived. Like, being caring is great. The problem is if you're the only one to do the care work, and if care work is seen as not real work. And so I think the problem is more the way submission is seen. And that's why I proposed, so that's why I'm trying to propose a non-moralized account of submission initially, because I think we have this first instinct to think, oh, submission, it's wrong and it's impermissible, and then saying that women submit to men means that women are morally inferior. And quite the contrary, what I want to do is to say, well, there are all these behaviors that are submission, and then we need to do some normative work and evaluate what is wrong, what is an injustice, but that the concept needs to do a descriptive work that needs to come prior to the normative work.
Yes, and I think I think your account of this is really interesting, and I think with the examples of submission in ordinary life that you gave, I think one of the difficulties of living as a woman under patriarchy is that there's frequently attribution ambiguity. Am I doing this because it's what I value, or am I doing this because there are norms? And there's some benefit to be had from complying with these norms. So I found, and
if I can just follow up about one small thing, I think it's also very important. It was very important for me because I was doing this work in France, where in France, submission is seen as what Muslim women do by opposition to real French women. So there's a racist trope of submission, of like this account of submission that I found very concerning. And to put it a bit bluntly, what I wanted to say was to show my peers that the fact that they eat boiled zucchini with no olive oil for dinner does not make, in order to be sexy and to be able to wear miniskirts, does not make them necessarily more free than a woman who wears the veil. And that this idea that the sexiness à la française is way more free than traditional forms of women's lives was very concerning to me. And I think the concept of submission is useful to see, like, it's not the other that is the dupe of patriarchy. We're all in a certain extent the dupe of patriarchy, and we need to find ways towards emancipation after having this consciousness of the oppression we live through.
Yes, I found that point, and I've been very interested in this point in the reception of your book in French as well, that submission is associated with Islam. Islam means submission, and so in Montesquieu's Persian letters, for example, you get this juxtaposition of the unfree Muslim and the free Frenchman, and also explicit comparisons of the kinds of submission that are expected of in this kind of orientalizing caricature of Persian women, and the free women of Paris. And so I enjoyed that, and I thought it was very interesting the way you also discuss submission in Ephesians. So in many Christian churches, wives are still encouraged to submit to their husbands because Ephesians 5 says to do that. So I think there are very interesting kinds of feminist and religious conversations that can be had around this concept. But you draw especially on Rousseau in the book, and you make the point that when Rousseau is talking about freedom, he has a kind of idealized conception that doesn't really do justice to the kinds of submission that women face in their daily lives. And so I wanted to ask you about the opening of chapter 4 of your book, because there you say that submission is an ordinary experience. It's lived by everyone. Everyone submits sometimes. So in your words, you said it's lived by everyone, and particularly by women. So I wondered if you could say something about what distinguishes the submission of men from the submission of women, and perhaps queer or non-binary people.
So I think, so my hope is to provide a concept of submission more broadly than just in this book. With my work on submission, what I was trying to do is provide a concept that would help us understand what is going on for people who live social domination. And so I think in that regard, people of color in the context of white supremacy, women in the context of patriarchy, workers in the context of capitalism are submitting themselves, and in a way that is different from the people who do not live this social domination. And so I think one of the main features is the reversibility. So I think that if you submit, so some people say, oh yeah, I submit to my wife about where we go on vacation. She's always the one who decides. And I take it that for submission to be real submission, you need to have something ongoing. That it's something that you can't reverse, that it's not like one time you submit, one time you dominate, that we empty these concepts from their meaning when we do that. But also what in chapter 4, especially, what I have in mind is that I take it that Rousseau sees and a lot of the contract theoricians see freedom as something we are born with. It's a natural quality that we have, and so submitting would be that you have your freedom and you say, no, actually, I don't want it. I give it back. But that, to the contrary, I think that Beauvoir's and the existentialist understanding of freedom it allows us to understand that freedom is something you need to conquer, that you need to work on, and that submission is not so much you saying, I don't want this anymore, than you not going on a quest for freedom. And that, of course, there are good reasons to do that for everyone. And one of them is the fact that it's scary to be free, and that it's easier to follow the rules of society and to do exactly what you're expected to do. And so in that regard, we can think that men and women submit to social norms, but that because the social norms are gendered and mean that men are encouraged to be adventurous and to try things and to be free, whereas women are asked to submit, there's a sort of second layer where submitting to social norms is being submissive.
Yes,
when you're a woman, I mean.
Yeah. So one of the chapters that I think in this book I would recommend to many audiences. I was actually thinking earlier today that I would recommend it to parents of prepubescent daughters, but the chapter on the objectification of the body and the experiences of alienation from their own bodies that often accompany maturing in a female body. I just think it's very powerful the way you unpack that. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit about the bodily aspect of submission in terms of especially objectification.
So it's true that, it's just an anecdote, but in France, I did this sort of little capsule video that they post on social media called Brut. And of course, as a feminist who does that, you receive so much hate mail and the worst possible comments. And one of the things, and they reposted it 2 days ago, so I had the occasion to relive through this harassment again. But one of the types of comments is to say, well, women don't have to submit. If they submit, like, too bad for them, they're really dumb. And then the comment after says, oh my God, you're so ugly, I would not even have sex with you against your will, and all these sort of things, and commenting on my breasts, on my face, on my makeup, and so both are very interesting to talk about this physical dimension or bodily dimension of submission and objectification. What I think is very important is that the existence of being a woman and being a girl is seeing that the entire world has or feels like they have a right to comment on your body and or to sometimes touch your body. I was pregnant recently. The ability of people to touch your body when you're pregnant or to comment on your body, you feel like your body is constantly something public, that is something that belongs to others before belonging to you. And I think that Beauvoir has a very strong analysis of this, and there's work by Fiona Vera Gray that talks about this, that it's actually the way it does work for many teenage girls, that their experience of their body is before their body can be something they have pleasure with or something they desire with. It's seen by others, it's commented by others, be it your really not cool uncle who says, oh, someone is having fits now, and these sort of super cringy interactions. Or I remember, as far as I'm concerned, being followed in the street at 10 by some guy. I think almost every woman has this experience of being a body for other people before having a body for oneself. And it does create the grounds for feeling like you need to serve other people, that your body that yourself is there for others before it's there for you, and to create a feeling of alienation with your body and with yourself, that is probably what makes submission both so tempting and sometimes pleasurable, because submitting to the gaze of men is also being validated by the gaze of male, and being told that this is the kind of validation you can have. Instead of climbing walls or climbing rocks or climbing mountains, you're looked at.
Yes, so I think the way you develop being for men, and the body is something to be seen by others, I think it's one of my favorite parts of the book. But I think before we move into questions, which we should do in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the emancipatory potential of thinking about submission?
So I think there are two sides of the emancipatory part. One is just the consciousness, what feminists call consciousness raising, is that I do think that suddenly having a word to describe something that you've been going through is extremely freeing. That suddenly you manage to connect the dots in a way that gives meaning to what you go through, and then gives you the tools to politicize it, right? That, like, in saying that's what the feminists have been doing with what is called consciousness raising groups, is showing that the private is political, and that there are a lot of personal experiences that we think are just our idiosyncratic experience are actually common to so many women and take different forms, but have a very common meaning and a common cause, that is patriarchy. So I take it that there is this power of the concept of submission, that we suddenly see the world through this prism, and it helps see injustice and harm. And then I think it's also very important because it allows to understand, or to be dubious of this idea that it's an individual endeavor. And I think a branch of feminism has been very pushy about how you need to fight, you need to be good, you need to be strong. And it was very clearly the case in the post-Weinstein France, when a lot of feminists have been saying, oh, I don't understand these young feminists that pretend that they're victims. They should fight, and they should not whine about the fact that they were victims of sexual assault. And that there is this sort of belief that it's just on you to not submit. And I'm trying to show that this is not true. And that, yes, there's a part of emancipation that you can do on your own, but that social change needs to happen. And social change may happen through activism that is brought by awareness, but it can't be just an individual quest of this sort of new agey feminism of let's free ourselves from the patriarchy. And I think one case that is particularly strong is the fact that patriarchy shapes our sexual desires also. And that a lot of, I think it's something that has been widely discussed these last few years, that a lot of women have fantasies that are not aligned with their political beliefs and their feminist beliefs. And instead of guilt tripping them, recognizing, well, this is the psychic life of power, and submission is ingrained in us, in our body, in our desires, and patriarchy shapes our lives in that way. And so I think this is a good thing to know in order to build emancipatory activism.
Okay, thank you. So I'll allow myself one more question before turning to the Q&A. So please do put your questions for Manon there if you haven't already. And I wondered finally, do you think feminists should aim to abolish feminine submission? That submission that you think is particularly feminine? Or do you think there's any sense in which there's the possibility of a reciprocal submission that could be ethical? Because I know you don't want to moralize submission, but I just wonder if you think what we need to do is abolish all of it, or if any kind of reform is possible.
That's a very good question, to which I don't have a very firm answer. I think if I'm going to give a very Beauvoirian answer, which is because I think she says something similar in the conclusion of The Second Sex, which is that if patriarchy were to lose its power, what is now seen as women's submission may still exist as forms of behaviors, but it would not be submission anymore. And it would not be that women don't have or are pushed to behave in a certain way, or are forced to behave in a certain way, but more that each woman can behave in the way they want, and some women will behave in ways that are now seen as submissive. But I think it's not so much that women should stop doing certain things, but more the fact that if patriarchy were to fade away, we can always dream, these behaviors would not be coded as submission anymore. So that's in that sense, yes, I want submission to disappear, but not so much in terms of I don't want women to become competitive bullies. I just or like abandon their kids or whatever. I just hope for a future in which they don't feel like they have to submit to men.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions. So I would love to respond to that, but I'm not going to. So our first question is from Sky Cleary. Sky Cleary. Hello, Sky. And she says, hello. Interested in the block quote from page 53 of Professor Garcia's terrific book about how Beauvoir disagreed with Sartre's notion of freedom, and wondering if you could discuss what you think Beauvoir meant by the following sentence, quote, I was right, but to defend my attitude, I should have had to abandon the plane of the individual and therefore idealistic morality on which we had set ourselves.
Hi, Sky. Thank you for this hermeneutical question. So just the context for other people who don't know this as well as Sky, Kate, and I do, there was, before Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, she had a fight with Sartre about what freedom is, and Sartre had this sort of very extensive understanding of freedom, saying everyone is free the same way, it's ontological freedom. And Beauvoir said, in the very Orientalist perspective of the time, but still, well, a woman in a harem is not as free as we are. So like, let's look at this. And eventually she yielded to him and said, okay, I agree with you, whatever. And in her memoirs, she said she shouldn't have. But so what I take the quote to say is that you can't, at the time they had an understanding of morality that was purely based on individualism and no analysis of the social structure. And I take it that it's really the war that shaped her in a way that she rejected this purely individualistic framework and recognized that she needed to bring some more social norms view. So that's one of the things I defend in the book, that she brought Heidegger and the idea of das Mann in Heidegger, and this idea that we behave in a conforming to a certain mood and a certain set of rules in a society. So sort of way more social-based analysis of morality. And that's what happened for her at the end of the war. But at the point where she has a fight with Sartre, she hasn't completely done this switch. And so I take it that this is what she wants to say, that what she calls his idealism is the fact that it's a sort of looking at the individual without an understanding of the social circumstances, what she will call the social situation of the individual.
Thank you very much. So our next question is from Aurora Georgina Bustos Arellano. She says, hello from Mexico. And she says that your book is really amazing and your work related to submission. And she wondered how your work enables philosophical and feminist dialogue with the also great work of Kate Mann about empathy enacted by women who seem to be submissive to the rules of patriarchy.
So I'm also a big admirer of Kate Mann. I think Kate Mann and I don't look at the same issues. She looks at what happens for men, and I look at what happens for women. And so, of course, there's an intersection where you're exactly where you identify it, in the sense that some women feel empathy for perpetrators, and in the moment that they do, they're being submissive to patriarchy. But I don't think that for Kate's work, that's really what is interesting. But yeah, for sure, that's where our work intersect. And I think, for instance, in this question of this concept of submission allows to understand the support of white women for Trump in the US, that there was this idea that, yes, he was a sexist sexual offender. I don't know if it's, yeah, well, it's not a very good description of Trump, but you see what I mean. But it was more important for them to vote like their fathers, like their husbands, like their brothers, that there were more, they had more sympathy for the men in their lives than for other women, and that was driving their votes.
Okay, so I'm going to take a question that relates to the question we've just had from Daphne Taylor Garcia. She says, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on issues such as that white women were almost 50% of slave owners in the American South, that the rise of the evangelical right wing in the US was significantly the work of a white women's organization that galvanized against the Equal Rights Amendment, and that the glass ceiling in Britain was broken by an architect of neoliberalism, etc. So what do you think about women's role in perpetuating submission? I guess is another way possibly of asking it.
So it's actually, thank you very much. It's a question that I have thought about a lot, about Phyllis Schlafly and also about Amy Coney Barrett, with this idea, because there was a discussion of saying, well, look, Amy Coney Barrett is a feminist. She has a lot of kids, and she's, for those who don't know, she's been appointed justice at the Supreme Court, and she's a so evangelical right-wing woman, and so I think that there is this sort of okay, let me try to be more clear. I think this is exactly what I was talking about earlier when I was critical of the individualism of a certain understanding of feminism, that this idea is like, you just have to not submit, and if you don't submit, you're not a victim of patriarchy. Then there is this sort of idea that Phil Schlafly and Amy Coney Barrett don't submit because they have jobs and they bring forward this anti-feminist agenda, but in a sort of we're independent women way. And I think that harms feminism because that confuses the meaning of what it is to be a feminist. And I think that what it is to be a feminist is to fight against male domination as a structure and not as in your individual life. And yes, I think that patriarchy, one of the effects of patriarchy on women's lives is to convince them that they should side with men and that they should side with the dominant, and that there is a case to be made that this is what was happening in white slave owning women, and yeah.
Great. So I've got a question now about the body, and then another question that I'll come back to afterwards about the concept of woman. So first, the body. This question is getting plastic surgery, for example, Botox, fillers, breast augmentation, a submissive act? Is it internalized sexism, mutilating oneself for the male gaze, like dieting? Or is there a way that these things can be done authentically? And how can you tell whether acts such as plastic surgery are authentic, that is empowering, something that makes oneself feel better about oneself, or submissive? So let's take that one first.
So it's a very good question, because at the core of it is a big philosophical question of, can you know better than the agent what they're doing? And so that's this idea of false consciousness of, like, what if this woman says, I only do it for myself? The fact that it makes me sexy by social standards and that I have a better standing in society when I'm sexy has nothing to do with the plastic surgery. Can we believe her or not? I think it's an impossible question. I think that the problem is that believing you're only doing it in a way like for your own empowerment or pleasure is already a sexist trope. So the way I would want to respond to this is that it's not really my question. My question is just to make available a concept to understand what can be going on, but not to judge women, not to say, oh, this one has fake breasts for good reason and this one has fake breasts for a bad reason. Like I'm not, and because I'm not even sure that doing it out of submission is a bad reason. So yes, it's an unsatisfying answer, but I hope that there's still something satisfying about it.
Thank you. Yes, our reasons aren't always transparent to ourselves anyway. So we've got two questioners asking similar questions, so I'm going to present them to you together. So from Moshe Cahill, we have two related questions. First, why must a woman be submissive in order to be feminine? And second, what is the wedge, that is conceptual wedge, that you can drive between feminism and submission? And then, let's see, there's another from an anonymous attendee, which says, your discussion brings to mind Catherine McKinnon's idea that female submission, or the hierarchical relationship between men and women, is constitutive of being a woman, and that under patriarchy, submissive relations are core to the construction of womanhood. This anonymous attendee asks, can we separate the concept submission from the concept of woman in a patriarchal society?
So thank you very much. I think I'm deeply influenced by Catherine McKinnon, but my view is not exactly the same as hers. But for sure, I think that what we call femininity in our patriarchal societies is submission. And at the difference of McKinnon, I don't think that this necessarily has to be the case, but I think that it is the case factually, and that there is no that maybe it is slowly changing when you see Megan Rapinoe, like, is she feminine? In a way, you could see that I think a lot of lesbians have redefined what femininity can be, and because they have been the ones who are probably the less, or the more able to be as little submissive as possible, because they don't need men's gaze as much as heterosexual women do. But so maybe there's the possibility of redefining femininity in a way that is not the synonym of submission, but I take it that femininity and submission are the same for now.
Okay, thank you. So I've got another hermeneutical question for you. This is from Dan McHugh. In chapter 9, Dan writes, your conclusion of submission includes a cost-benefit trade-off. Can you explain why you decided on this measurement, which seems utilitarian, instead of using Simone de Beauvoir's different levels of freedom that she describes in her Ethics of Ambiguity? And how might we apply those levels of freedom to women in the US and France and help them overcome their submission?
So thank you, Dan, and thank you for your other questions also that were not part of this event. So my first reason to not use the Ethics of Ambiguity so much is because Beauvoir said such negative things about it later on. So I feel like I'm being I'm using a framework that she deemed to not work anymore with her framework from the second sex, and I take it to be that it is the case for her, because in the Ethics of Ambiguity, she still has this very individualistic perspective that she condemned in the quote that we discussed with Kate Kirkpatrick earlier. So of course, when I talk about cost-benefit analysis, it sounds utilitarian in a certain way, but that's I'm not having a utilitarian use of it. The work that this expression does for me in chapter 9 is to say that that in a way we have adaptive preferences. It's a sort of similar thing as adaptive preferences. So it is to say, well, if you know that wanting something is gonna mean that you're gonna be punished by it, and that you're gonna have to live at the margins of society, that like a lot of things like this, maybe you should you learn to not want this anymore. And I take it that it is the case that there are social norms and social institutions that are in place that make submission relatively not costly for women, and make freedom relatively costly for women. And therefore that it's a difficult bet to choose to be free. And that's just why I'm using this framework of cost benefit in the book.
Okay, so we've got a question now about how consciousness raising leads to politicizing from Tatiana Luent. Focusing on the politicizing aspect, do you have in mind policy recommendations that could effectively change the state of things you describe in the book?
I do, but I think they depend from country to country. For instance, I think that the problem of submissiveness is very different in countries like France, where motherhood is not socially so costly compared to countries like Germany or the US, where everything is made such that motherhood is very difficult, or at least very little compatible with individual freedom. So like depending on the country, in France you have a lot of policies that make it possible for women to keep working if they want to. In the US, it's not the case. On the other hand, in some parts of Germany, you have way less pressure to be sexy and submissive in your behavior, whereas in France it is. So I think yes, there are policy making consequences of my analysis, but they depend on countries.
Yeah, and one of the things I think your book discusses really insightfully is Beauvoir's concept of the situation, and the importance of paying attention to the concrete economic and political situations of particular women. And that leads next well into a question that we have from Candice Delmas, which is, what would you or Beauvoir make of the Black intersectional feminist critique of the notion that there is such a thing as the, quote, common oppression of women qua women, independently of their sexual orientation, race?
So I think I want to say both that I find this critique very convincing and that I still think we can save submission and Beauvoir from it, in the sense that it is true that what it meant for a long time to say there's a common oppression of women qua women was to think that this oppression took exactly the same forms for whatever women out there. But I think Black feminists especially have shown that it's not the case, and they made a compelling case that it's not the case. However, I do believe that women qua women are oppressed in a certain way by patriarchy, and that the concept of submission allows to understand some parts of it. And to give you an example, I've been thinking a lot lately about the role of this imperative of submission in racism. And I think that in the context of America, for instance, you have a very specific anti-Asian woman racism that is grounded on the idea that they're too submissive. And you have a very specific racism against Black women that is grounded on the idea that they're not submissive enough, that they're too aggressive, too outspoken, and that in a way, and then you have a valorization of the right white women, Republican white women that are submissive the right way, like Amy Coney Barrett. But I still think that there is this thing in common, that is, women are evaluated towards this standard of submission, and that this is a form of specifically patriarchal oppression. I think
that's one of the things that the book and the concept do so well, because patriarchy is a many-headed hydra. It takes many forms, but in most of its forms, it does seem to expect submission. So we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask, there's a lot of very interesting questions. So apologies to those of you whose questions I haven't got to. To end with, there's one from Lucy Bolton. Would you consider the concept of submission informs debates and schisms within feminism? For example, the extreme feminist wars between radical and liberal feminists on trans feminism. In other words, does a model of submission apply to behavior or positionalities within feminism?
That's a good question. So in a way, the feminist war that I've been a bigger part of is the war between what is presented in France as the war between universalism and intersectionality. And I think the concept of submission is useful there because it allows to show, it allows to argue that universal feminists don't see that submission takes forms that are validated in the context of the French Republic, that they identify in other women, and that intersectionality allows to see that their blindness to this is part of racist stereotypes. In the discussion about trans issues, I don't know, like for me, yeah, I haven't really thought about how the concept can help in that in that discussion, I have to say.